fire at a food processing plant. This is for Taylor Farms.
By the time I got here, the building was engulfed in flames.
We are on the precipice of a global food crisis.
We haven't seen how bad this is going to get yet. I mean, everybody's talking about the cost of food. There's not going to be any food.
You did? Wait, when?
Up until we blew it up.
Oh my gosh, again, look at this, guys. Look at this video right now.
Warning, the following presentation is highly controversial and will be shocking to most people. It warns of a potential collapse of America's food supply network, something that could lead to mass starvation, chaos, and even death. The information that follows is not based on fiction, fantasy, or speculation. And the truth is that we may only have months, weeks, or even days before the window of opportunity to prepare your loved ones is shut for good. The information contained inside this video could save your life.
Hi, my name is Henry Cobb. I'm an American patriot who is sick and tired of being lied to by the government. And in the next 7 minutes, I'm going to bite the hand that has fed me my whole career, spit in the face of their globalists and their hidden agendas, reveal devastating and dangerous secrets the people at the top are terrified you'll find out, and show you an astonishingly simple way to protect you and your family from the coming food emergency, all without spending your hard-earned money on long-term food storage or expensive growing kits. Something that will keep your family fed no matter how bad inflation gets, no matter how empty grocery stores become, and no matter what evil the government has planned next. In fact, if you do what I say in this short video, like 37,000 men and women all over the world have done before you, you'll find yourself grinning ear to ear like a love-struck teenager, saving hundreds or even thousands of dollars on inflated groceries, enjoying a never-ending supply of fresh, delicious, calorie-dense food, protecting friends and family, and be the hero when shit hits the fan. Who the heck am I to say this? Like I said, my name is Henry Cobb. I'm a history professor, husband, and a father of 2 little girls. And what I'm going to reveal in this video is the most important message I've ever given in my entire life. It could save the lives of tens of thousands of Americans like you who see the writing on the wall, but who, despite stocking up guns, ammo, canned foods, and bottled water, are still sitting ducks in the face of what's to come. But I'm not just here to be the bearer of bad news, because if you're one of the lucky few who somehow stumbled into this video, then I'm also going to show you the simplest, fastest, and most effective strategy to secure your family's future starting today. Something that ensures that you and your family never go hungry and allows you to live self-sufficiently, even off the grid. Something that will make you rich in the only currency that matters when shit hits the fan, so you can buy all of the clothes, ammo, and medicine your loved ones will ever need. And something that will fill you with confidence of knowing how to handle every situation that comes your way, from ducking thieves and corrupt government officials to defending your homestead. In other words, I'm going to show you how to build a total fortress of protection around you and those you love most. One that virtually guarantees you rise to the top of the fallen society. It's not going to take much time, barely any at all. It's not going to cost you a fortune, just a few spare dollars. And it works no matter how old you are, if you don't have any help, or if you're a survivalist klutz like me. I know that may sound hard to believe right now, but it's what countless Americans who've watched this video have already experienced for themselves. So I urge you to stay and watch this video until the very end, because I'm going to prove every word of what I'm saying. I'm also going to tell you about the 3 collapse triggers that historians use to predict mass starvation months before it hits, as well as why toilet paper shortages during the pandemic were actually a deadly warning sign that America will soon run out of food, along with how the now hiring signs you see popping up all around the nation could point to a fatal flaw in our global supply chain. I probably don't have to tell you that the powers that be don't want me sharing this message. It doesn't fit into their approved narrative. which means it's very likely this video will disappear from the internet forever. If I didn't think this message was the most important thing I could ever do, perhaps even my life's calling, then I would never put my family and I at such risk. So please, turn off any distractions, take notes if you have to, and pay close attention to what I'm about to tell you. You're just seconds away from discovering everything you need to lead your family to total freedom and safety in the next few months. Like I said before, my name's Henry Cobb. I'm 43 years old and I live in southern Colorado with my wife and 2 daughters. And I'm a professor of history at a small junior college in town. My whole life I've spent in the study of history, fascinated with the big arcs of civilization, the empires that have risen and the empires that have fallen, which is why I've become more and more worried as I've watched the state of the world over the past few years. Like you, I've begun to notice just how strange everything has become. And I'm not just talking about the pandemic either. I don't know if you felt the same way, but deep inside, it just feels like something is off. Like the whole world is hanging on a thread, and at any moment, it could collapse in front of our eyes. I don't consider myself a conspiracy theorist. I never have. But in the past few years, things have changed. Like the whole world is hanging on a thread, and at any moment, it could collapse in front of our eyes. Now, it seems like the whole world has gone crazier than ever, and common sense is anything but common. So I wasn't looking for signs of some apocalyptic doom. I was simply paying attention, probably like you, to the signs that were popping up all around me. It all started when I went to visit my local bakery. But when I went to go inside, I found the doors were locked. On the door was a sign, closed, early due to staff shortages. And below that another, now hiring. Well, that's odd, I thought. In all my years living here, I'd never seen anything like that. Then it happened again at the grocery store. After paying for my groceries, I was surprised to see my total came out to about $15 more than what I expected. I mean, I've shopped at this store 1,000,000 times, and give or take a few dollars, I can usually guess how much things were going to cost. I checked my receipt to see what I was missing. "It's the meat prices," a voice said behind me. It was the manager. "Nothing we can do about it," he said. Again, that's odd. Later that week, I received a letter from my daughter's school. Inside, it told me how her school was experiencing food and drink shortages because of supply chain issues and labor shortages. This finally got my attention. You know how sometimes you feel just like something's off? Well, that's how this felt. I did a quick search online and discovered that these cafeteria food shortages were happening all over the country, in Alabama, Kansas, Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, and more. So I kept digging a little deeper. That's when I discovered a surprising trend. Labor shortages, food shortages, supply chain breaks. The more I found, the more agitated I became. And soon that agitation turned to outright worry. See, there's something I probably should have told you. I'm a historian, yes. But specifically, I'm in a field called economic history, which is about as boring as it sounds. But it means that I'm trained at studying big trends like the collapse of economies, social unrest, and, in this case, famine. For my master's thesis, I even wrote about a theory known as collapse triggers, 3 specific triggers that, whenever they appear together, inevitably lead to a collapse of a nation's food supply. And one thing you'll see throughout history is that when the food goes, everything else goes with it. So what are these collapse triggers? Like I said, there's 3. Natural disaster, skyrocketing food prices, and supply chain meltdown. Whenever they appear together, mass starvation always follows. It happened in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, China in the 1950s, and Korea in the 1990s. The reason why is actually very simple. First, natural disasters cripple food supplies. Then prices skyrocket, which leads to protests and chaos. Then supply chains shut down as countries isolate themselves. The inevitable result? Disaster every single time. So why did I feel a pit in my stomach growing bigger and bigger? Because I saw each and every one of these collapse triggers lining up before our eyes, and almost nobody seemed to be paying attention. In the words of one food industry CEO, we're sleepwalking towards disaster. Let me show you why. Collapse trigger number 1, catastrophic natural disaster. See this picture? It looks like an image of the Gobi Desert, but it's not. That's what used to be the riverbed of a major river in South America. Normally, it looks like the Mississippi River, and large barges use it to carry tons of grain across the continent. Now they can't, which means it costs $315 million more to transport that same amount of grain. Guess who foots that bill? People like you and I. Then there's Brazil. Right now, the country is undergoing a drought of biblical proportions, worse than it's ever been in the past 91 years, which might not seem like this would affect you and I in the States. But consider that Brazil is the largest producer of soybeans in the entire world. And who eats soybeans? Cows, pigs, chickens. That's right, 98% of the soybeans produced in the world, most of it grown in Brazil, goes to feeding the livestock that make up our meat industry, which is just one reason why meat prices have soared, and why one prominent CEO said, quote, "It's game over for the meat industry." But it's not just meat. Here in the U.S., we're in the midst of one of the worst droughts in history. Wave after wave of extreme heat has smashed records, crippling our tomato industry and threatening over 25% of our nation's crops. Meanwhile, this heat has allowed grasshoppers to sweep through the country like an Old Testament plague, destroying millions of acres of crops along the way. A recent 2020 study from Columbia University said that the U.S. is facing an imminent, near total depletion of the U.S. food reserves, where over 94% of our wheat reserves could become totally exhausted. Then there's the flooding in China's key pork-producing region, and the rains that wiped out 2.4 million acres of critical farmland. Then there's the devastating rains in the EU causing fungal diseases in grains, and the drying up of the Russian breadbasket, shrinking its wheat crop far below normal amounts. Meanwhile, countries from Ireland to Japan to Turkey to Moscow to Kuwait are all experiencing record-breaking heat waves, putting even more stress on our global food supplies. And look, I know it's easy to hear these statistics and think, well, yeah, this kind of stuff has been going on forever. What's the big deal? That's normally what I would think too. But after listening to the way that those with boots on the ground describe the situation, critical, urgent, game over, unprecedented, highly unusual, unseen in the last 1,000 years, it's clear that what's going on right now is not typical. And my fear is that this might trigger the worst mass starvation event ever in human history. First collapse trigger activated. Collapse trigger number 2, skyrocketing food prices. The cost of meat, poultry, and eggs have soared in recent months. Restaurant chains from Chipotle to Red Robin to Cracker Barrel have all been forced to raise prices to keep up with cost. And the CEO of Unilever, one of the biggest food companies in the entire world, described the situation as unprecedented. Everywhere you look, food prices are going up, and the trend is not slowing down. And even though prices are at a 13-year high, executives from General Mills to the Campbell Soup Company have all warned that they'll be forced to raise prices even more if supply chain issues continue. COVID kicked off the trend. Then there were the mega droughts in Brazil and California I told you about, which led to even further price spikes. Then overseas transportation costs have surged by about 250%. And the Federal Reserve, who has been printing money like there's no tomorrow, all of which forced prices upwards. Meanwhile, China has gone on an unpredictably huge shopping spree, buying massive amounts of world's food supply. And our supply chain is creaking under the stress more each day. Can you imagine what will happen when food prices become so expensive that most people can't afford groceries? Well, you don't have to imagine. Just look at Iran, which is not a poor country, but where violent nationwide protests have been spreading like wildfire since the beginning of 2021. Or look at the food riots that swept across more than 31 countries in 2008 to 2011, killing hundreds of people and injuring countless more. If you thought that the BLM protests of last spring were bad, or the Antifa riots in downtown Portland were awful, or the lockdown protests in Australia were scary, just wait until gangs of marauding thieves are roaming the streets, wide-eyed with hunger, furious because the stores are empty, or they can't afford eggs for their families. Imagine the desperation inside everyday Americans as they realize, one after the other, that our food banks are now empty. Nobody's going to save them. And the fabric of society they thought would hold them up forever is nothing but a frayed, dirty rag. That's the world we're heading to. And that's the second collapse trigger activated. Collapse trigger number 3, supply chain meltdown. Whenever someone starts talking about supply chains, it's easy for your eyes to just roll over. It sounds boring, but I hope you're beginning to see now just why it's so important. See, it's one thing to have natural disasters wipe out the majority of the world's food supplies, and it's another thing to have food prices skyrocket so high that most people can't even feed their families. But those two alone aren't enough to lead to total social breakdown. As long as nations keep cooperating and picking up the slack, the world can normally navigate out of the situation just fine. That's exactly what happened in 2008. First, droughts, just like we're seeing today, crippled the world's food supplies. Then prices skyrocketed, causing massive unrest and protest in more than 31 countries. For a while, the whole world teetered on the balance of like some giant wobbly game of Jenga. But then, right in the nick of time, countries began organizing to make up for all the losses. Japan released its rice reserves to the market, bringing the price down. Organizations like OREC were founded to help stall rising food prices. And the G8, composed of countries like the US, UK, Canada, and Germany, all worked together to put an end to the crisis. Between that and the sudden relief from drought and heat waves, the world scraped by through its first major hunger scare. But now, the last glimmer of hope is growing dim, because in order for nations to work together and navigate out of a crisis, you need two things. One, cooperation, and two, intact supply chains. Right now, we have neither. The U.S. is currently embroiled in a trade war with China, which, if you remember, has been on a buying binge, purchasing more than 25% of the world's crops. Meanwhile, COVID kicked off multiple trade bans from major food supplying countries like Vietnam and Russia. One by one, the nations of the world are closing themselves off to preserve what precious few resources they have left. But even if countries were cooperating with each other, it's become almost impossible to move food around the world. I mean, all of us have seen just how fragile our supply chains are. We saw how a single ship turned sideways in the Suez Canal cost us more than $6 billion and resulted in 30% decline in freight travel for weeks. Or how lumber prices soared by 288% because there weren't enough drivers to move timber across the country. Or how a microchip shortage in Taiwan pushed car prices up and emptied out car dealerships across the country. The supply network is failing. The great big web that's kept the systems of our world intact for the past few decades is slowly beginning to unravel. At some point in time, nobody knows when or how, there will only be one single thread left holding us back from mass chaos. When that thread goes, everything we know and love will go along with it. I call it the Great Unraveling. All it takes is one event, and it doesn't take much. Once it happens, the world will wake up to see that the emperor truly has no clothes. And when that happens, we could see starvation at unprecedented rates, chaos in the streets like never before, and a level of government dependence unlike anything we have seen before. Collapse trigger number 3, activated. If all this wasn't enough to make it clear how disastrous the direction we're headed in truly is, consider what else I found. In June of 2021, a group of hackers stole more than 11 million from JBS, the largest beef supplier in the entire world, marking the first in a string of attacks costing Americans billions of dollars. Meanwhile, Bill Gates has been quietly buying up more than 269,000 acres of farmland, making him the biggest private landowner in the country. Whatever you think of Gates, there has never been a single individual with this much control of our nation's food. One judge described his actions as Napoleonic, and I agree, because whenever someone seizes so much control of our food, they decide who eats and who doesn't. Meanwhile, a recent UN report flat out said that millions are in danger of starvation. Then there are the countless quotes from the CEOs of major food suppliers and organizations like the UN. I think we're heading towards a brick wall in a car with no brakes. Nick Allen, CEO of the British Meat Producers Association, BMPA. We risk a looming food crisis, U.S. Food and Agricultural Organization. We are weeks away from gaps on the shelves. Richard Burnett, CEO of the Road Haulage Association. The driver shortage in the food supply chain is at crisis point. James Bilby, CEO of the Federation of Wholesale Distributors. Humanity is facing the greatest crisis any of us have ever seen. David Beasley, head of the UN World Food Program. As I sat back from my computer, I felt a heavy sense of darkness, almost like a black cloud gathering around me. But inside, I knew that it wasn't time to give up. The fact that I had seen the writing on the wall meant I still had time to prepare. And it meant I still had time to warn as many people as I could. I thought I knew exactly where to start, too. It was a long shot, but I might just be able to warn a few people. So I printed out all my evidence and put it into a folder. I knew my case needed to be as airtight as possible for what was about to come. And as I held the thick folder in my hand, I thought, surely this has to be enough to convince people of what was coming. It was the night of our parent-teacher organization meeting for my son Jake's school. They had called an emergency session to discuss the recent food shortages. As I stepped into the cafeteria, I could hear the friendly chatter of the other parents, but I felt sick to my stomach. Was I really going to do this? I sat there listening as each parent spoke, talking about ways to fill in the gaps. But the whole time, I couldn't help but think, they have no idea what's coming, do they? My heart pounded in my chest. I felt a lump in my throat. I knew it was going to be my turn next. My hands gripped my folder until my knuckles turned white. Then I heard the voice, Henry? You had something you wanted to say? And I stood up and I looked at the crowd of faces turned towards me. My name's Henry, and I stumbled getting the words out. Speak up, someone yelled from the back. This was my moment to turn back, I thought. Nobody would know the difference. Besides, who did I think I was? But that's when I remembered a quote that my old history professor used to have scrawled on a blackboard back in college. He made us repeat it every day. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. It was all I needed. So I began. We are weeks away from a crisis far bigger than any of us could ever imagine. As I began to outline my case, I felt more emboldened. I talked faster. I pleaded with everyone to take what I was saying seriously, to prepare their families, to not close their eyes to what was going on. I must have talked for about 10 minutes. When I finished, I didn't know what I'd expected. Maybe some giant applause like in the movies. Instead, all I saw were blank stares. Finally, someone yelled out, "Yeah, thanks a lot, Chicken Little." The crowd burst into laughter. The PTO president walked over, kindly put his hand on my shoulder, and gave me a pitiful smile. "That's enough, Mr. Cobb. Please have a seat." That night, I came home feeling defeated. I thought that people would care, that they'd at least listen, but it fell on deaf ears. I knew then that the only thing left was to prepare myself and my family. So I started making plans. When the great unraveling finally did happen, nobody had any clue how long it would last. It could be weeks, months, even years. It was impossible to tell, but I knew that I'd have to prepare myself for as long as possible. But that's when I ran into an even bigger brick wall. See, I already had a small little pantry stocked up with cans, but when I started looking at how much it would cost for survival food to last for several years, my heart sank. Just to prepare my small family for a few months could cost around $1,900. But to feed them for 5 or even 10 years could cost as much as $37,000. That just wasn't something we could afford on my salary. Meanwhile, you have to keep rotating these foods in and out to keep them from expiring. The more I looked into my options, the more confused I became. There was just too much information. And when you have a limited budget, limited time, and limited expertise, it all just felt like a little too much. I needed a break. Maybe I'm making too big a deal out of all this, I thought. That's when I heard a ping from my email. It was a new email from an address I'd never seen before. And the subject line read, "It's worse than you know." That's strange, I thought. So I opened it and began reading. "Call me R," it began. "You don't know me, but I know you. I saw you speak the other night at the PTO, and I admire your bravery. Common sense and courage are rare commodities nowadays. I think you're 100% right about what's coming, but there's another piece to this puzzle I think you should know about. It might be shocking to you, and you might not want to believe it, but I believe it's important for you to know about. From one patriot to another, R. P.S. Email me here if I can help." Below this were a few hundred words outlining what he meant. As I read through what he sent, I felt my heart rise up into my throat. So be warned. Like R said, the information is shocking, and I don't know how you'll respond to it or if you'll think it's true. Truthfully, I'm still not sure myself, but I do believe that every American deserves to know what was in that email, so I'm going to share it with you. All I ask is that you keep an open mind, because whether or not you believe R's interpretation of what's to follow, I believe it points the way to an even more specific picture of what's to come. And it makes clear the best way to protect your family. Are you ready? Here's what R sent me. First, he told me about a 2010 document published by the Rockefeller Foundation with the innocent-seeming title, Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development. It's since been scrubbed from many parts of the internet. If you can find a copy of it, you'll see that inside is a 54-page document where a group of global elites outlined scenarios for what might happen over the next 20 years. The scenarios begin to look suspicious. Again, I'm not saying any of this is some kind of a conspiracy, but the coincidences are at least enough to make you think. You see, the 2010 Rockefeller paper begins by describing how even locally, normally bustling shops and office buildings sat empty for months, devoid of both employees and customers. It continues, noting how leaders around the world flexed their authority and imposed airtight rules and restrictions, from the mandatory wearing of face masks to body temperature checks at the entries to communal spaces like train stations and supermarkets, even leading some countries to develop a form of biometric IDs for all citizens. Now, as strange as this all seems, it could just be a well-meaning scenarios of what could happen in a public health crisis. But that's when things get weird. On page 34 of the document, it notes how a once-in-a-millennium natural disaster, one blamed on climate change, would hit parts of China and put enormous pressure on the already overstressed global economy. It explains how massive humanitarian relief efforts would simply run out of resources. And then it describes the oddest scenarios yet, noting how the U.S. would pull out of Afghanistan, where, quote, the resurgent Taliban seize power once again. When I read this, the hair on my neck stood up. How could a 2010 document align so closely to events we see today? One after the other. Empty shops, mandatory mask wearing, Taliban control of Afghanistan. What were the odds of that? I didn't know, but as I read the next few lines, the coincidences became even more unbelievable. What followed were three specific scenarios. First, there would be global food and resource shortages caused by severe economic and climate stresses. Then, soaring food prices would bring low-level conflict in resource-rich parts of the developing world, order rapidly disintegrating, and safety nets evaporating. The outcome? Violence and crime grew more rampant. And finally, nations raised trade barriers in order to protect their domestic sectors against imports and reduce exports of agricultural produce and other commodities. The global coordination and interconnectedness was tenuous at best. In other words, the supply chain collapses. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Here was a document from 2010 which seemed to have predicted every major news cycle of the last few years, including the one we're currently living in. I kept reading. Those who couldn't buy their way out of chaos, which was most people, retreated to whatever safety they could find. And after all was said and done, the document concludes, by 2030, the distinction between developed and developing nations no longer seemed particularly descriptive or relevant. In other words, America and every other first world country could sink into third world destitution. Now, my head was spinning. I had no idea how something like this could be simulated, but I also didn't know how it could be a coincidence either, with so much detail. Plus, why would anybody want all of this? R had left me a message at the bottom. Regardless of whether you believe there's some conspiracy at work, or whether you think it's God's judgment on humanity, or just the foolishness of world leaders, the outcome is the same. He continued, personally, I believe it's part of an agenda to seize control. A food shortage that leads the way to the new Great Reset, where meat becomes a luxury, where Gates-backed impossible meat becomes the new normal, and where, in their own words, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Ever wonder why the media seems so eager to push insect meat on us? I believe that this is the reason, a level of control bordering on slavery. But regardless of what you think, the truth is that the great unraveling, as we call it, is likely only months away, and the window of opportunity we have to prepare ourselves is shrinking. I hope the world takes notice. As I finished reading, I wasn't sure what to think, so I stepped outside to clear my head, watching the clouds from overhead. I felt the same sense of heaviness again. Walking past all my neighbors' houses, I wondered how long they would survive if this crisis were to hit. 2 weeks? 3 weeks? It started to sprinkle. I tried to warn them before, but this time the need felt even more urgent. Not to get dramatic, but it almost felt like the last days of Noah, right before the skies ripped open and flooded the whole world. But despite how bad everything appeared, and as strange as it may sound, as I continued walking, I began to feel hope. The rain fell heavier. I hadn't been in church in a long time, but I could remember the voice of my grandmother telling me how God always left a remnant of his people, how light always shines the brightest in darkness, how good beats evil. So as nightmarish as everything seemed bad, I knew there was still hope. I knew there was still time to save others. It started pouring, so I ran back home, this time filled with even more determination. When I got back, I wrote our response. I told him that I needed his help, not only a way to prepare my own family, but also a way to help others before it was too late. A few hours later, he sent me a reply. He told me to meet him tomorrow in the parking lot of our local grocery store. He told me to come alone and to leave my cell phone in the car. So the next day, I showed up, followed his instructions, and waited. Almost a half hour went by before I started getting ready to leave. That's when a white pickup pulled up beside me, and I heard a gruff voice telling me to get in. It was R. He had me tie a bandana around my eyes to protect the location of his ranch. And we drove for what must have been about 25 minutes. When we finally arrived at his ranch, I could tell that we were in the middle of nowhere. R introduced himself as Ray, and he told me his story of how he'd grown up in rural West Virginia, trapping and fishing and hunting. He told me how he used to be an Eagle Scout and about his experience serving in the military as Special Forces. Survival was encoded into his DNA. But as he began watching the direction of the world, he realized how many people would be caught if things went from bad to worse. He knew he wanted to do his part to protect as many innocent lives as possible. But Ray was gruff, with a grizzled white beard, leathery skin, and the piercing eyes of someone who's seen things that other people could only imagine. Now, I'm no good at talking, he told me. But when I saw you in that meeting, I knew that you could be my voice. When I asked Ray what message he wanted me to share, he explained that most people go about prepping in all the wrong way. Yes, stored food is essential, but it doesn't do much good if you have to get up and evacuate, he said. And it will only last you a short while. What people really need, he explained, is never-ending supply of fresh, vitamin-rich food. Their personal Garden of Eden they can carry with them wherever they go. When I asked him what he had in mind, he began showing me around his ranch, and he introduced me to something he called an aquaponics system. This is step one, he said. Now, if you've never heard of aquaponics before, here's the lowdown on it. See, aquaponics is the exact pocket-sized Garden of Eden that people need, where fish and plants sustain each other in an almost perfect balance. It has two parts, one filled with live fish and the other a vegetable garden. The plants purify the water for the fish, while the fish do all the hard work for you, fertilizing the plants with their waste. That way you get tasty fish and juicy vegetables, almost without lifting a finger. It's better than simply hydroponics because you don't have to buy tons of plant food to keep your plants alive. Meanwhile, the fish farming is too impractical and dirty on its own. But once you bring the two together in a happy marriage, you get the best from hydroponics and fish farming with none of the drawbacks. It's a win-win scenario for the plants, for the fish, but mostly for you because there's no watering required, no fertilizing, no bending, and actually no real work. The only problem? Most do-it-yourself aquaponics systems are too confusing, complex, and downright worthless, while others you can buy cost upwards of $6,000 or more. But Ray explained that he'd spent years perfecting an unbelievably simple way that anyone can build their own aquaponics for 98% less than it normally costs. Nobody's teaching this stuff the right way, he said. Not on the internet, not in books, and not on YouTube. As far as I can tell, I'm the only one who's perfected this method. But that's just the first part. Ray went on to show me an odd triangular dome structure hidden in his backyard. Apparently, the unique design of this dome allows anyone to grow pounds of juicy tomatoes, bell peppers, and delicious zucchini almost year-round. And all it takes to build is a couple of 2x4s and some plastic sheeting. Its geometric design perfectly reflects sunlight even in cloudy areas. It automatically regulates temperature. And it's so sturdy it won't break in heavy weather. Between these two, you'll have enough food until doomsday, he said. But that's not all. He went on to show me another method to grow 100 pounds of food in just 4 square feet of space, even without sunlight. And he showed me how to fit each piece of his system together perfectly, giving you more food than your family could ever eat, no matter where you live or how much space you have to work with. Guns and ammo are good for protection, he explained, but nothing beats the guy or gal who knows how to make all this stuff. What's inside your head is something nobody can take from you. You can carry it with you everywhere you go. And when shit hits the fan, 99% of the people will have no clue about any of this stuff, making you an irreplaceable asset to anybody. I began to realize what Ray was showing me was the closest thing to total freedom, protecting me from skyrocketing food prices and giving my family and I the peace of mind that we will survive any food crisis. And it's something that could keep you safe no matter what catastrophe comes your way. So over the next 3 days, I took careful notes of every detail of Ray's system. I made him outline it all very simply, so simple that a 10-year-old could follow the instructions. Everything had to be easy enough that an 80-year-old couple or a single mom could put it all together. And we brainstormed ways to keep all of the supplies cheap or even free. After what felt like an eternity, I finally had all the details of his system written down. So I rushed back home and carefully typed them up. When I was finished, I sent a copy to one of my friends, Joseph, who was one of the only people who took my advice at the PTO meeting. Here's what he said about it. At first, I wasn't sure this would be as easy as you made it sound, but damn, it only took me like a few hours to put it all together. Whoever came up with this stuff is a genius. He told me that he even shared it with his mother-in-law who lives in...
Okay, so let me get back in the picture. I thought he said 7 minutes. That's like 30 minutes. Anyway, I myself, the aquaponics I like, that's one way. But I myself am starting something that I call Hemp, Profit Sharing Community. So we'll also be growing food, but I'm naming it Hemp because I believe, I'm not a nutritionist, I believe that if we don't have regular foods like vegetables and fruits, that if we were growing cannabis, let's not forget the marijuana part. If we were growing cannabis and part of that was growing hemp for food, we could survive off of eating foods made from hemp products and water. So I have a system to make water from the humidity in the air. And I'm trying to gather people right now for hemp. So that is what this video is about. So for now, I'm out. Peace. Let's get together for survival. Let's get together because unless you're from another planet, you eat food like I eat food. Unless you're from somewhere really cold and don't wear clothes, you need clothes. Unless you're from somewhere where they don't live in houses, you probably need some place to live in. Dada, 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 on and on and on. One seed, one plant, and the land to grow that plant on. And we can make all those things that we need to be self-sufficient. Get it? Check it out. Don't believe me. I'm out. Peace. Oh, wait. Peace. Peace and love. And all that good shit.